The Mapmaker's Journey, read by Chuck Brown. The old cartography shop sat tucked between a used bookstore and a small cafe on a quiet street lined with maple trees. Their leaves had turned the deep gold and crimson of late October, and they drifted down like gentle confetti, carpeting the sidewalk in a rustling tapestry of autumn colors. Inside the shop, surrounded by maps both ancient and modern, Eleanor Rosewood carefully cleaned the glass surface of an antique surveyor's compass with a soft cloth. Eleanor had inherited the shop from her great-uncle Theodore 6 months ago, along with his passion for the art and science of mapmaking. At 34, she'd been working as a freelance graphic designer, creating digital layouts and web interfaces from her small apartment. But when Uncle Theodore passed away and left her his life's work, she'd found herself drawn into a world she'd barely known existed. A world where geography was poetry, where every mountain range told a story, and where the careful plotting of rivers and roads was an act of quiet meditation. The shop was a marvel of organized chaos. Rolled maps stood in tall cylindrical containers like sleeping scrolls, while flat files held carefully preserved charts dating back centuries. The walls were covered with framed maps of places both real and imagined. Detailed surveys of the Amazon basin hung beside hand-drawn fantasy kingdoms, and nautical charts of the Mediterranean shared space with topographical maps of mountain ranges Eleanor had never heard of, but somehow longed to explore. Above the main counter, a collection of antique instruments caught the afternoon light. Brass sextants that had once guided ships across uncharted oceans. Theodolites used to measure angles with scientific precision. Each tool had its own story, its own history of exploration and discovery. Eleanor had spent countless hours during her first months here simply examining these instruments, learning their purposes, imagining the hands that had once operated them with expert skill. The back room of the shop housed Uncle Theodore's personal collection, maps he had drawn himself during his decades as a surveyor, along with journals filled with meticulous notes about terrain, weather patterns, and the countless small details that transformed raw geographical data into living, breathing landscapes. Eleanor had been slowly working her way through these documents, trying to understand not just the technical aspects of her uncle's work, but the passion that had driven him to spend his life documenting the world with such loving precision. This evening, as rain began to tap gently against the shop's front windows, Eleanor was working on a special project. She'd been commissioned to create a custom map for a couple celebrating their 40th wedding anniversary. A map that would trace all the places they'd lived and traveled together over the decades. It was the kind of work that made her heart sing, turning a lifetime of shared experiences into something beautiful and tangible. She'd spread the large sheet of cream-colored paper across her drafting table, weighted down at the corners with smooth river stones Uncle Theodore had collected from various expeditions. Each stone told its own story. This one from the Colorado River, worn smooth by centuries of flowing water. That one from a beach in Nova Scotia, where Uncle Theodore had spent a summer mapping coastal erosion patterns. Eleanor had come to think of these stones as anchors, holding her work steady while her imagination soared. Her tools were laid out precisely: compass, protractor, ruling pen, and bottles of ink in various shades of blue and brown. A small lamp with a green glass shade cast a warm circle of light over her work area, creating an intimate space within the larger shop. Eleanor had learned to appreciate the ritual of preparation almost as much as the actual map making. The careful arrangement of tools, the selection of the proper paper, the mixing of inks to achieve exactly the right shade. Elena had already sketched the basic coastlines and major geographical features, working from a collection of reference maps and atlases. Now came the delicate work of adding the personal touches: the small house in Vermont where the couple had honeymooned, the lake in Minnesota where they'd bought their first home, the winding road through Oregon where they'd taken memorable road trips with their children. As she worked, Elena found herself entering that peaceful state of focused concentration that had become one of her favorite aspects of mapmaking. There was something deeply satisfying about the precision required, the careful attention to scale and proportion, the way each line had to be exactly right. It was meditative in a way her previous work had never been. Less about speed and efficiency, more about patience and craftsmanship. The transition from digital design to traditional cartography hadn't been easy at first. Elena's hands had been accustomed to keyboard and mouse, not pen and compass. She'd made countless mistakes in those early weeks, smudging ink, miscalculating distances, drawing lines that wavered when they should have been straight. But Uncle Theodore had left behind detailed instructional notes, and Elena had slowly learned to appreciate the unforgiving nature of ink on paper, how it demanded complete attention, how it rewarded patience and punished haste. The rain outside grew steadier, creating a gentle percussion against the windows that seemed to encourage even deeper focus. Elena dipped her pen in the sepia ink and began drawing the delicate lines that would represent the Blue Ridge Parkway, where her clients had taken their children camping every summer for 15 years. Each curve of the road had to be just right, each mountain peak properly positioned relative to its neighbors. She'd spent hours preparing for this particular section of the map, studying topographical surveys and satellite images to understand the true geography of the region. But more than technical accuracy, Elena wanted to capture the emotional geography of the place, the sense of adventure and family bonding that had made these annual camping trips so significant to the couple who had commissioned the map. As she drew, Elena remembered her own childhood camping trips with her parents, before the demands of adult life had made such simple pleasures seem impossible to maintain. There had been something magical about those times: the smell of wood smoke and pine needles, the sound of her father telling stories around the campfire, the way the stars seemed so much brighter away from city lights. Perhaps that was part of what drew her to mapmaking, the hope of recapturing that sense of wonder, that feeling that the world was vast and full of places waiting to be discovered. The couple's story, as Elena had learned it, was remarkably similar to many of the love stories that had found their way into her custom maps. They had met in college, married young, and spent their early years moving frequently as career opportunities took them to different states. Each relocation had been an adventure, a chance to explore new landscapes and build new memories together. The map Elena was creating would trace that journey, from their first apartment in Boston to their current retirement home in Arizona, with stops in a dozen states along the way. Elena paused in her work to examine the photograph the couple had provided, a faded color snapshot of themselves standing beside their first car, a battered Volkswagen Beetle that had carried them on countless road trips during their early marriage. They looked impossibly young in the photo, their faces bright with the optimism of people who believed the whole world was available to them. In a way, Elena thought, that belief had proven true. Their map would show just how much of the world they had indeed made their own. As she worked, Elena found her mind wandering to her own journeys, her own maps, both literal and metaphorical. 6 months ago, she never could have imagined herself here, in this quiet shop filled with the accumulated wisdom of centuries of explorers and cartographers. Her life had taken an unexpected turn, like a river changing course after spring floods, and she was still adjusting to this new landscape she found herself in. The career change had required more than just learning new technical skills. Elena had discovered that mapmaking demanded a different way of seeing the world, a different relationship with time and space. Digital design had trained her to think in pixels and vectors, in files that could be endlessly revised and updated. Traditional cartography required her to think in terms of permanent marks, decisions that couldn't be undone, lines that would remain exactly as drawn for decades or even centuries. There was something both terrifying and liberating about that permanence. Elena had spent her first few weeks paralyzed by the fear of making irreversible mistakes. But gradually, she'd learned to embrace the finality of ink on paper, to find confidence in her ability to make decisions and commit to them. The process had changed her in ways that extended far beyond her professional life. She found herself more decisive in general, more willing to commit to choices and trust in her own judgment. The rain continued its gentle rhythm against the windows, and Elena noticed that the street outside had grown quiet. Most of the other shops on the block closed earlier than hers, and she often found herself working alone as evening settled over the neighborhood. She didn't mind the solitude. In fact, she had come to treasure these quiet hours when she could work without interruption, when the only sounds were the scratching of her pen and the soft percussion of rain against glass. Elena smiled as she added a small cabin to represent the couple's retirement home in the mountains, complete with a tiny curl of smoke rising from the chimney. She drew the smoke with special care, using the finest point of her pen to create delicate wisps that seemed to dance upward from the chimney. It was details like this that transformed a simple map into something magical, something that captured not just the geography of a place, but the feeling of home. She added a canoe on the lake where the couple had learned to fish together, positioning it carefully so that it appeared to be gliding across the water's surface. Elena had become skilled at these tiny illustrations, learning to suggest complex scenes with just a few carefully placed lines. The canoe wasn't just a decorative element. It represented years of quiet mornings on the water, shared sunrises, the patient teaching and learning that had deepened the couple's relationship with each other and with the natural world. Next, she drew a small airplane to commemorate the trip to Ireland they'd taken for their 25th anniversary. According to the notes they'd provided, it had been their first international travel together, a grand adventure that had opened their eyes to possibilities they'd never considered before. Elena drew the plane with its wings spread wide, suggesting movement and freedom, the excitement of crossing oceans to explore distant lands. Each detail was a story, a memory transformed into cartographic art. Elena had learned to see her custom maps not just as geographical documents, but as visual biographies, chronicles of lives well lived and love that had endured through decades of change and growth. Every commission taught her something new about the human experience, about the ways people connected with places, and the role that geography played in shaping identity and memory. As she worked on the decorative border that would frame the entire map, Elena found herself thinking about Uncle Theodore and the legacy he had left her. In addition to the shop and its contents, he had bequeathed her something even more valuable, a way of seeing the world that valued exploration, curiosity, and the careful documentation of experience. She was beginning to understand that cartography was more than a profession. It was a philosophy, a way of engaging with the world that emphasized attention, patience, and respect for the complexity of any landscape, whether physical or emotional. The border she was creating combined traditional cartographic elements with personal symbols meaningful to the anniversary couple. She drew compass roses at the four corners, each one slightly different in design, but all pointing toward true north, a symbol of the constants that had guided the couple through 4 decades of shared life. Between the compass roses, she added small illustrations representing their shared interests, books for their love of reading, musical notes for the piano they played together, hiking boots for their passion for exploring nature trails. As the rain continued its gentle rhythm against the windows, Elena found herself growing pleasantly drowsy. The warm light from her work lamp, the repetitive motion of careful drawing, and the peaceful atmosphere of the shop all combined to create a sense of deep relaxation. The familiar weight of the pen in her hand, the slight resistance of the paper's surface, the way the ink flowed in smooth, controlled lines, all of these sensations had become deeply comforting to her. She completed the last few decorative elements on the anniversary map and set her pen aside, admiring her work. The map was beautiful, not just as a functional representation of geography, but as a celebration of a life shared between 2 people who had chosen to explore the world together. Elena felt a warm satisfaction at having created something so meaningful, something that would bring joy and memories to the couple who had commissioned it for years to come. The process of creating custom maps had taught Elena to appreciate the stories hidden in every landscape. She had learned to read the subtle signs that revealed how people had shaped the places they lived, and how those places had in turn shaped them. A well-worn path through a city park spoke of daily walks taken together. A lake house positioned for optimal sunrise views revealed priorities about beauty and natural connection. Every detail on her maps carried emotional weight, geographic meaning encoded with personal significance. Elena moved the completed map to a flat file drawer where it would be safe while the ink dried completely, then returned to her drafting table. Almost without conscious decision, she found herself reaching for a fresh sheet of paper and spreading it across the work surface. Tonight felt like a night for imaginary geography, for letting the mind wander to places that existed only in dreams and stories. This had become Elena's favorite part of her new life, the evening hours when commissioned work was complete and she was free to explore the purely creative aspects of cartography. Uncle Theodore had left behind several of his own imaginative maps, and Elena had been inspired to continue that tradition. There was something liberating about creating geography that answered to no earthly authority. Landscapes shaped entirely by imagination and artistic vision. Elena began with the coastline, letting her pen follow whatever curves felt right, creating bays and peninsulas that had never been shaped by geological forces but seemed perfect nonetheless. She drew without a specific plan, letting the map emerge organically, the way explorers of old might have sketched the shores of newly discovered lands. The coastline that emerged was complex and interesting, with deep fjords cutting inland like fingers of the sea, and broad bays that would provide natural harbors for the ships of whatever civilization might inhabit this fictional realm. As she worked, the shop grew quieter around her. The street outside had settled into the peaceful stillness of a rainy night, with only the occasional car passing by, its headlights briefly illuminating the maple leaves pressed against the wet windows. The sound of the rain had become a constant soothing backdrop, like being inside a tent during a gentle camping trip in the mountains. Eleanor found herself imagining the inhabitants of the fictional land taking shape under her pen. She drew a city at the mouth of a great river, with careful attention to how such a settlement would naturally develop. Docks and warehouses near the water, residential areas climbing the surrounding hills, roads following the easiest grades through the landscape. She gave the city walls and towers that suggested both beauty and practical defense, with gardens spilling over the ramparts and bridges arcing gracefully across the river. The city she was creating reminded her of places she had studied in Uncle Theodore's historical maps, medieval European ports where commerce and culture had flourished under the protection of thoughtful urban planning. But her fictional city improved upon those historical models, incorporating lessons learned from centuries of human settlement. The streets she drew were wide enough for both foot traffic and commerce. The residential districts were positioned to take advantage of prevailing winds and natural light, and the public spaces were distributed throughout the city rather than concentrated in a single area. Inland from the city, she sketched a vast forest, using tiny symbols to represent different types of trees. Here were groves of oak and maple, there patches of pine and fir climbing toward mountain slopes. She added clearings with small villages, connected by winding roads that followed the natural contours of the land. Each settlement had its own character in her mind. One might be known for its skilled woodworkers, another for the healing springs that bubbled up from deep underground. Elena had learned from Uncle Theodore's notes that the best fictional geography followed real-world principles. Climate patterns had to make sense. River systems needed to flow downhill from their sources, and human settlements had to be positioned where they could actually survive and prosper. Even in imagination, certain laws remained constant. Their attention to plausibility made her fictional landscapes feel authentic, as if they could actually exist somewhere beyond the edge of known maps. The mountains she drew next were inspired by ranges she'd seen in Uncle Theodore's surveys, but filtered through imagination and fairy tale. These peaks soared impossibly high, their snow-covered summits disappearing into stylized clouds. She drew passes between them where traders might travel, and high valleys where mysterious peoples might dwell in isolation, their cultures shaped by the dramatic landscape around them. As Elena worked on her imaginary map, she felt her consciousness shifting into that peaceful space between waking and dreaming that often came with repetitive, meditative tasks. Her hand moved almost automatically now, guided by some inner sense of what the fictional landscape should look like. She was no longer Elena the graphic designer or even Elena the mapmaker. She was an explorer discovering new territory, a chronicler recording the geography of dreams. She drew a great lake in the center of the continent, fed by rivers flowing down from the mountains. Islands dotted its surface, some large enough for cities, others mere rocky outcrops where seabirds might nest. She imagined the lake's water was the clearest blue-green, so transparent that fish could be seen swimming in its depths, so pure that travelers would stop just to drink from its shores and feel refreshed in body and spirit. The lake became the heart of her fictional continent, the feature around which all other geography seemed to organize itself. Trade routes would naturally follow the shoreline, connecting the mountain passes with the great river that flowed toward the lake. Fishing villages would dot the shores, their economies based on the abundant lake trout and pike that thrived in the clear waters. In the deeper sections of the lake, Elena imagined ancient ruins lying preserved in the cold depths, remnants of civilizations that had flourished here before some long-forgotten catastrophe had raised the water level and submerged their cities. The desert she added to the southern regions was unlike any real desert she'd studied. Instead of being barren, it was dotted with oases that bloomed with impossible abundance. She drew caravan routes connecting these green jewels, paths worn smooth by centuries of traders carrying precious goods and exotic stories between distant cities. In her imagination, this desert was a place of mystery and beauty, where the night sky blazed with stars, and the dawn painted the sand dunes in shades of rose and gold. Elena spent considerable time perfecting the caravan routes, ensuring they followed realistic patterns between water sources while maintaining the romance and adventure that such journeys implied. She added way station settlements at regular intervals, small fortified compounds where travelers could rest, resupply, and exchange news from distant lands. Each way station would have its own character. Some might be known for their skilled blacksmiths who could repair wagon wheels and horseshoes, others for their storytellers who could entertain weary travelers with tales of adventure and magic. Elena's eyelids were growing heavy now, but she didn't want to stop working. There was something deeply satisfying about this act of creation, this building of a world line by careful line. She added a chain of tropical islands off the eastern coast, each one carefully positioned and shaped. Some were volcanic, with cone-shaped peaks and beaches of black sand. Others were coral atolls, ring-shaped and perfect, their lagoons colored in shades of turquoise and jade. The islands she created followed realistic patterns of volcanic formation and coral growth, but enhanced with the kind of natural beauty that existed more in dreams than in reality. She imagined each island having its own unique ecosystem, its own endemic species of plants and animals that existed nowhere else in her fictional world. The volcanic islands would be home to spectacular waterfalls and hot springs, while the coral atolls would boast underwater gardens of unprecedented beauty and diversity. As she drew, Elena began to feel as if she were actually visiting these places she was creating. She could almost feel the warm sand of the tropical beaches beneath her feet, almost hear the call of exotic birds in the forests she was creating. The boundaries between imagination and reality were blurring in the most pleasant way, and she found herself drifting deeper into the world taking shape under her pen. She drew ancient ruins throughout the landscape, crumbling towers that suggested lost civilizations, stone circles that might have been built for purposes now forgotten, underground chambers where treasure hunters might discover artifacts of immense historical value. Each ruin had a story in her mind, a connection to the deeper history of this fictional world. The ruins she added weren't randomly placed, but followed logical patterns of historical development. The oldest structures were positioned where geography would have supported the earliest settlements, near water sources, in defensible positions, along natural trade routes. Newer ruins showed the expansion of civilization across the continent, the rise and fall of empires, the way human ambition and natural disaster had shaped the cultural landscape over imaginary millennia. Elena found herself creating a complex mythology for her fictional world as she worked. The stone circles, she decided, had been built by an ancient people who possessed deep knowledge of astronomy and engineering. The underground chambers were the remnants of a civilization that had been forced to live below ground during a long age of darkness, perhaps caused by volcanic activity or some other natural catastrophe. The crumbling towers marked the boundaries of an empire that had once unified much of the continent under a single rule. The drowsiness was becoming stronger now, but it was a peaceful drowsiness, like sinking into the world's most comfortable bed after a long, satisfying day of travel. Elena's head began to nod as she worked, and she found herself entering a dream state, still adding tiny details to the map spread before her. In her dream, she was walking through the landscape she had created, following one of the roads she had so carefully drawn. The sun was warm on her shoulders, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of flowering trees from the nearby forest. She could hear the sound of running water somewhere ahead, one of the rivers she had sketched, now real enough to provide the music of flowing water over smooth stones. The road beneath her feet was well maintained, paved with stones that had been fitted together with such skill that barely a crack showed between them. This was clearly the work of master craftsmen, people who took pride in creating infrastructure that would last for generations. Along the roadside, Elena noticed small shrines and way markers, signs that this was a route that held significance for the people who traveled it regularly. Other travelers shared the road with her, people from the cities and villages she had imagined into existence. They nodded friendly greetings as they passed, some leading pack animals loaded with goods, others walking with the easy stride of those who loved the journey as much as the destination. Everyone seemed unhurried, content to take their time and enjoy the beautiful landscape around them. Elena came to a hilltop that offered a magnificent view of the lake she had drawn at the center of the continent. In her dream, it was even more beautiful than she had imagined, vast and blue, with the snow-capped mountains reflected perfectly in its still surface. Islands dotted the water like green jewels, and she could see boats moving slowly between them, their white sails catching the gentle wind. She sat down on a sun-warmed boulder and pulled out the map she carried in her dream, the very map she had been creating in the waking world. But now it was complete, filled with details she didn't remember drawing. Every valley had a name written in elegant script. Every city was marked with appropriate symbols. Every river was traced from its mountain source to its meeting with the sea. Looking at the map in her dream, Elena felt a deep sense of accomplishment and peace. She had created something beautiful and meaningful, a world where travelers could wander safely, where every settlement welcomed strangers with kindness, where the landscape itself seemed designed to inspire wonder and contemplation. As she studied her creation, Elena became aware of other figures approaching. They climbed the hill toward her with the unhurried pace of dream logic, and as they grew closer, she recognized them as fellow mapmakers and explorers from throughout history. There was Uncle Theodore, looking younger and more adventurous than she remembered, carrying a surveyor's kit and smiling at her work with obvious pride. Others joined them, cartographers famous and unknown, explorers who had charted real continents and imaginary islands, all drawn together by their shared love of discovery and documentation. They gathered around Elena's map, examining it with the appreciation of professionals who understood the skill and imagination required to create such a work. "Every map is a story," Uncle Theodore said in the dream, his voice warm with approval. "And every story is a kind of journey. You've learned that now." Elena nodded, understanding in the way that dreams allow perfect understanding without explanation. She looked out over the landscape spread before them, her landscape, born from imagination and given form through careful craftsmanship. It was more real now than many places she had actually visited, more meaningful than any digital design she had ever created in her previous career. The gathering of cartographers began to share their own stories, tales of expeditions to remote corners of the world, of maps drawn under impossible conditions, of the satisfaction that came from accurately documenting previously unknown territories. Elena listened with fascination, realizing that she had become part of a tradition that stretched back centuries, a lineage of people who understood that maps were more than mere tools. They were expressions of humanity's eternal desire to understand and explore the world. The dream began to shift and soften around the edges, the way dreams do when sleep deepens and the mind moves toward complete rest. Elena found herself back in the cartography shop, but now it was transformed. Maps covered not just the walls, but the ceiling, creating a canopy of explored worlds above her head. The rain had stopped, and moonlight streamed through the windows, turning everything silver and magical. She was lying on a comfortable couch that hadn't been there before, covered with a soft blanket that seemed to be woven from starlight and story threads. Her completed map lay on the drafting table nearby, glowing faintly with its own inner light. Every line she had drawn pulsed gently, as if the fictional landscape had developed its own heartbeat. Elena felt herself sinking deeper into peaceful sleep, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom and wonder of every explorer who had ever set out to chart unknown territory. She was part of that tradition now, a keeper of maps both real and imagined, a guide for those who sought to understand the geography of dreams as well as the topography of the waking world. In her deepest sleep, Elena dreamed she was a map herself, not drawn on paper, but existing as pure possibility, as the potential for infinite journeys and discoveries. She was every path not yet taken, every destination not yet reached, every story not yet told. She was the space between the known and the unknown, the bridge between imagination and reality, the place where all true exploration begins. And in that deepest dream of all, Elena found perfect rest, knowing that tomorrow she would wake to continue her work, creating maps that would guide others not just through physical landscapes, but through the infinite territories of wonder and possibility that exist in every human heart. The end. Rest now, dear traveler, and let your dreams chart new territories of peace and possibility, knowing that every ending is simply the beginning of another beautiful journey.